April 9, 1917. Easter Monday. The darkest hours before dawn settle over the battered landscape of northern France. Along a 7-kilometer stretch of elevated terrain known as Vimy Ridge, thousands of men huddle in trenches carved into the chalky soil, their breath visible in the freezing air. Snow begins to fall, driven sideways by a howling wind that cuts through wool uniforms and steel helmets alike. The temperature hovers just above freezing, but the men waiting in those muddy trenches feel colder than any winter morning back home. These are not British regulars who have held this ground for months. These are Canadians, farmers from Saskatchewan, lumberjacks from British Columbia, fishermen from the maritime provinces, factory workers from Ontario, students from Quebec. 100,000 strong, they represent every corner of a young nation still finding its identity within the British Empire. Tonight, for the first time in the Great War, all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps stand together, shoulder to shoulder, preparing to accomplish what others could not. Above them rises Vimy Ridge itself, an imposing escarpment that rises 145 meters above the surrounding Douai plain. From its highest points, German observers can see for tens of kilometers in every direction, directing artillery fire with devastating accuracy against any movement in the Allied lines below. The Germans have held this commanding position since October 1914, transforming it into what they believe is an impregnable fortress. 250 miles of trenches snake across the ridge. 300 miles of barbed wire stretch between defensive positions. 200 machine gun emplacements sit protected in reinforced concrete bunkers, each commanding overlapping fields of fire that can turn any approach into a killing ground. The French had learned this terrible lesson in 1915. Their attacks on Vimy Ridge cost over 100,000 casualties, brave men who charged up those slopes only to be cut down by the thousands, their bodies left to rot in the spring mud between the lines. The British attempted their own assaults in 1916 with similarly catastrophic results. The ridge became known as a graveyard, a place where attacks went to die, where the German defensive system proved too strong, too deep, too well coordinated to overcome. But the Canadians believe they can succeed where others failed, not through superior courage, for the French and British had shown extraordinary valor in their attempts, not through greater numbers, for the attacking forces had often outnumbered the defenders. The Canadians intend to win through something different: meticulous preparation, innovative tactics, and a level of planning that transforms modern warfare from crude attrition into something approaching military science. When the Canadian Corps relieved the British forces along the western slopes of Vimy Ridge in October 1916, they inherited a strategic nightmare. Lieutenant General Julian Byng, commander of the Canadian Corps, and his subordinate Major General Arthur Currie, immediately began developing a radically different approach to the problem. They sent officers to France to study recent French operations at Verdun, where the defenders had pioneered new defensive tactics. These Canadian officers returned with detailed reports on artillery coordination, small unit tactics, and the importance of thorough preparation. The plan they developed was comprehensive and revolutionary. Every aspect of the coming assault received exhaustive attention. Canadian engineers began excavating 12 major subways, underground passages that would eventually total 6 miles in length, dug at depths of 33 feet below the surface. These weren't crude tunnels hastily dug in the dark. They were engineered passageways equipped with electric lighting, piped water, and light rail lines for moving supplies. Some featured rooms large enough to hold 300 soldiers, complete with medical stations, communication centers, and ammunition storage. The Zivy Cave, one of the largest, could shelter entire battalions safely beneath the German artillery bombardment. These subways served multiple purposes. They allowed Canadian troops to move forward to attack positions without exposing themselves to German observation or artillery fire. They provided protected routes for supplies, ammunition, and the evacuation of wounded. They housed command posts and communication hubs. Most importantly, they gave Canadian soldiers confidence. While German shells pounded the surface above, men could rest, prepare equipment, and steel their nerves for the coming assault, knowing they would emerge fresh and ready rather than exhausted from a dangerous approach through open ground. Above ground, Canadian artillery officers pioneered techniques that would revolutionize modern warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew McNaughton, a 29-year-old McGill University engineering professor, developed a system of sound ranging that could pinpoint enemy artillery positions with unprecedented accuracy. By placing microphones in no man's land and using geometric calculations to determine how long sound waves took to reach each sensor, McNaughton's teams could locate German guns within 28 yards and identify their caliber, all in less than 5 minutes. When the preliminary bombardment began, Canadian gunners systematically destroyed German artillery batteries with devastating precision. The artillery preparation itself demonstrated a new level of sophistication. Beginning March 20, 1917, over 1,000 Allied guns began a sustained bombardment of German positions. This wasn't the traditional approach of a brief, intense barrage followed immediately by an infantry assault. Instead, the bombardment varied in intensity over nearly 3 weeks, with the heaviest firing spread across a 7-day period the Germans would remember as the Week of Suffering. This approach prevented the Germans from determining exactly when the infantry assault would begin while methodically destroying defensive positions, cutting barbed wire, and suppressing German artillery. The Canadians employed a new type of fuse, the number 106 instantaneous fuse, which detonated shells upon contact with barbed wire rather than allowing them to bury themselves in the ground. This technical innovation proved crucial. Previous bombardments at battles like the Somme had often left barbed wire obstacles intact while creating enormous craters that actually impeded attacking infantry. The new fuses systematically destroyed the wire barriers that had stopped previous assaults, creating clear paths for the coming attack. Perhaps most revolutionary was the extensive training program. Behind the lines, Canadian engineers constructed full-scale models of the German trench system, using tape to mark positions and hills to replicate terrain. Every battalion, every company, every platoon rehearsed their specific objectives repeatedly. Officers on horseback carried flags to represent the advancing artillery barrage, teaching infantry soldiers to move at exactly the right pace to stay within the protective curtain of exploding shells. Maps were printed by the thousands and distributed down to individual platoons, an unprecedented level of detailed planning that ensured even junior leaders understood the overall plan. The Canadian approach recognized a harsh reality of modern warfare. Officers and senior non-commissioned officers had high casualty rates. In previous battles, when leaders fell, attacks often stalled as confused soldiers lost direction. The Canadian solution was radical: train every soldier in the duties of those beside and above them. If a sergeant fell, a corporal would take command. If a lieutenant died, a sergeant would lead the platoon. This created a robust, adaptable force capable of continuing the attack despite inevitable losses. Infantry platoons were reorganized and specialized. Instead of masses of riflemen, each platoon now contained distinct sections: riflemen for fire and movement, Lewis gunners for suppressive fire, rifle grenadiers for indirect fire support, and specialized bombers carrying bags of grenades for clearing trenches and bunkers. This combined arms approach at the platoon level gave junior leaders unprecedented tactical flexibility. The Germans defending Vimy Ridge were not oblivious to these preparations. By late March 1917, the German Sixth Army knew a major offensive was imminent. Their intelligence services had identified the Canadian Corps presence and understood that all 4 divisions were concentrating opposite the ridge. Several Canadian deserters provided detailed information about attack plans and participating units. The Germans prepared their own response, planning spoiling attacks to disrupt Canadian preparations. But the intensity of Canadian artillery fire made these operations impossible to execute. 3 German divisions held Vimy Ridge. The 79th Reserve Division in the northern sector defending Hill 145, the 16th Bavarian Division in the center and south, and the 14th Bavarian Division in reserve. These were experienced units that had held this position for years, knowing every trench, every firing position, every approach. They had deep dugouts capable of protecting troops during bombardments, extensive communication trenches, and carefully registered artillery defensive fire plans. The German defenders numbered approximately 8,000 men in forward positions with thousands more in reserve, supplemented by artillery batteries positioned on the reverse slopes where they were protected from direct observation. As midnight passes and April 9 begins, the final preparations accelerate. Canadian soldiers emerge from their dugouts and subways, moving to jumping-off positions in the forward trenches. The snow continues falling, reducing visibility to mere yards. The wind howls across no man's land, muffling sounds and making the miserable night even more uncomfortable. Officers synchronize watches with obsessive precision. Artillery officers check firing tables one final time. Signalmen test communication lines. Medical personnel prepare stretchers and bandages. Chaplains offer final prayers for men who know that before the sun sets, thousands of their comrades will be dead or wounded. At 5:29:30, the Canadian artillery opens fire with a roar that drowns out every other sound. Nearly 1,000 guns discharge simultaneously, creating a wall of explosions along the German front lines. The earth itself seems to shake from the concussion. Flashes of light illuminate the falling snow, creating a surreal, almost beautiful display that masks the terrible destructive power being unleashed. At exactly 5:30, whistles blow along 7,000 yards of Canadian front line. Officers shout commands that barely carry over the artillery's thunder. From trenches, from subways, from saps dug forward during the night, 15,000 Canadian infantry surge forward into no man's land. The creeping barrage begins its methodical advance, shells exploding 90 meters ahead of the infantry and moving forward every 3 minutes like a protective curtain of high explosives and shrapnel. The weather proves both curse and blessing. The driving snow and sleet reduce visibility to almost nothing, but this works in the Canadians' favor. German sentries, huddled in dugouts during the bombardment, emerge to find shadowy figures already upon them, materializing out of the snow like ghosts. Machine gun crews struggle to see targets through the weather and the smoke. The element of surprise, combined with the precision of the artillery barrage, gives Canadian infantry crucial seconds to close with German positions before effective resistance can be organized. The 1st Canadian Division, commanded by Major General Arthur Currie, advances on the southern flank toward the village of Thalis. Despite heavy German machine gun fire from positions that survived the bombardment, Currie's troops move steadily forward, staying close behind their protective barrage. When they reach German trenches, specialized bombing sections clear dugouts with grenades while rifle sections provide covering fire. The coordination between artillery and infantry proves nearly perfect. German defenders, stunned by the bombardment and unable to see approaching infantry until the last moment, often surrender rather than fight. To the north, the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Divisions experience similar success. Their objectives include the villages along the ridge and several strongly fortified positions. The creeping barrage method proves its worth repeatedly. German troops, trained to emerge from their deep dugouts immediately after a bombardment lifts to man defensive positions, find themselves trapped. The Canadian barrage doesn't lift, it moves, and Canadian infantry follows so closely that they reach German trenches while defenders are still underground or just emerging. Hand-to-hand fighting erupts in the narrow confines of trenches as Canadians clear position after position. But on the northern flank, the 4th Canadian Division faces a different situation. Their objective is Hill 145, the highest point on the ridge and the linchpin of the German defense. The German 79th Reserve Division has fortified this position more heavily than any other sector. Machine gun nests occupy mutually supporting positions. Concrete bunkers shelter troops and weapons. The approaches offer no cover, and the steeper slopes make advancing difficult even without enemy fire. The 4th Division's assault bogs down almost immediately. German machine gunners who survived the bombardment emerge from deep dugouts and open fire on the advancing Canadians. Men fall by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Units become disorganized in the snow and smoke. German artillery, positioned on the reverse slope and protected from Canadian counter-battery fire, drops shells among the attacking troops. A German position called the Pimple, a fortified knoll northwest of Hill 145, adds enfilading fire from the flank, catching Canadian soldiers in a crossfire. Officers and sergeants attempt to reorganize their units under fire, but the German defensive fire proves too intense. The 4th Division's first assault on Hill 145 fails, leaving hundreds of casualties scattered across the slope. As morning progresses, it becomes clear that while 3 Canadian divisions have achieved their objectives ahead of schedule, Hill 145 remains firmly in German hands. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, Canadian troops consolidate their gains while the 4th Division regroups for another attempt. The weather worsens, with snow falling more heavily and the wind increasing in intensity. But by noon, Canadian forces control most of Vimy Ridge. Villages that had been German strongpoints for years are now in Canadian hands. German prisoners stream back toward Canadian lines, many appearing relieved to be out of the fighting. Individual acts of valor occur across the battlefield. Private William Milne single-handedly attacks multiple machine gun nests, clearing the way for his company's advance before being killed. Lance Sergeant Ellis Sifton charges into enemy trenches under withering fire, eliminating German positions and enabling his battalion to continue forward, earning a posthumous Victoria Cross. Captain Tyne MacDowell, finding himself deep inside German positions with only a few men, captures 2 German officers and 75 soldiers through sheer audacity, using psychological tactics to convince them they're surrounded by a much larger force. As afternoon fades toward evening, the 4th Division launches renewed attacks on Hill 145. Fresh battalions move forward, including the 85th Battalion, Nova Scotia Highlanders, originally designated a labor battalion but pressed into combat at the critical moment. These reinforcements, combined with artillery support and the exhaustion of German defenders who have been under bombardment for 3 weeks, finally tip the balance. On April 10, after hours of bitter fighting, Hill 145 falls to Canadian forces. The highest point on Vimy Ridge, the position where the Vimy Memorial would later stand, is finally in Canadian hands. One objective remains: the Pimple, that heavily fortified knoll at the northern end of the ridge. German troops still hold this position, from which they can observe and fire upon the entire northern sector. The 4th Division requires 2 more days to prepare for the final assault. At 5 in the morning on April 12, through another snowstorm even more severe than that of April 9, Canadian infantry attack the Pimple. The assault is swift and decisive. German defenders, isolated and demoralized after watching the rest of the ridge fall, offer limited resistance. By midday, the Pimple is Canadian. The entire ridge, every meter of that 7-kilometer escarpment, belongs to the Canadian Corps. The cost has been severe. Over those 4 days of fighting, the Canadian Corps suffers 10,602 casualties. 3,598 men are killed, including many who died during the preliminary bombardment or in the months of preparation before the battle. April 9 alone claims approximately 3,600 lives, making it the bloodiest single day in Canadian military history. The wounded number 7,000, many suffering injuries that will leave them disabled for life. Every Canadian battalion that participated suffers significant casualties, with some frontline companies losing more than half their strength. German casualties remain less precisely documented, as was typical for the period. The Germans lose at least 4,000 men as prisoners, captured in the fighting or found sheltering in dugouts after the battle. Killed and wounded likely number several thousand more, though exact figures have never been definitively established. What is certain is that the German Sixth Army has been dealt a significant defeat. Losing a position they considered nearly impregnable and suffering damage to their reputation as an unstoppable defensive force. The strategic significance of the Vimy Ridge victory extends beyond the immediate tactical situation. The ridge's capture gives the Allies an observation platform overlooking the Douai Plain, allowing forward artillery observers to direct fire on German positions, supply lines, and troop movements. The German army is forced to withdraw several kilometers to the east, abandoning positions they had occupied since 1914. The success at Vimy also serves its intended purpose of drawing German reserves away from the French front, where the Nivelle offensive is about to begin. But the battle's true significance transcends military strategy. For Canada, Vimy Ridge becomes something far more important than a tactical victory. This is the first time all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps fight together as a unified formation. It is the first time Canadians fight under predominantly Canadian commanders, executing a Canadian plan operation. And it is the first significant Allied victory after years of costly stalemates and failed offensives. Brigadier General Alexander Ross, watching the assault unfold on April 9, would later write words that resonate through Canadian history. It was Canada from the Atlantic to the Pacific on parade. I thought then that in those few minutes I witnessed the birth of a nation. Whether Vimy truly represents the birth of Canadian nationhood remains debated by historians, but the power of this narrative proves undeniable. For a young Dominion still finding its place in the world, still tied to British Empire policies, still uncertain of its own identity, Vimy provides a defining moment of achievement and sacrifice. News of the victory spreads across Canada within hours. Newspaper headlines proclaim Canadians lead in triumph and famous ridge captured by warriors from Canada. The success at Vimy contrasts sharply with the larger Battle of Arras, which achieves limited gains at enormous cost. While British and French offensives bog down in the same bloody attrition that has characterized the Western Front for years, the Canadians accomplish their objectives with relative efficiency, using innovative tactics and thorough preparation to overcome what others considered an impossible challenge. In 1922, recognizing the battle's significance, the French government grants Canada perpetual use of a 100-hectare section of the former battlefield. Canadian authorities commission Toronto sculptor and architect Walter Seymour Allward to design a memorial. Allward's vision is ambitious and profound. Twin pylons representing Canada and France, rising high above the ridge, with allegorical figures representing peace, justice, truth, and knowledge. At the base, a figure titled Canada Bereft represents a young nation mourning her fallen sons. Construction takes 11 years. The memorial is built from limestone quarried in Croatia, each block carefully shaped and placed to create a structure that seems to grow naturally from the ridge itself. The names of 11,285 Canadian soldiers killed in France who have no known grave are inscribed on the memorial walls, ensuring they will never be forgotten. The surrounding battlefield is preserved, with trenches and craters maintained to show future generations the landscape where the battle was fought. On July 26, 1936, King Edward VII unveils the memorial before a crowd of over 50,000 people, including more than 6,000 Canadian veterans who have made the pilgrimage to Vimy. The ceremony is deeply emotional, with many veterans weeping openly as they remember fallen comrades. The memorial becomes, and remains, the focal point of Canadian remembrance of the Great War, a place where succeeding generations come to honor sacrifice and reflect on their nation's history. The innovations pioneered at Vimy Ridge influence military tactics for the remainder of the war and beyond. The creeping barrage technique, the use of sound ranging and flash spotting for counter-battery work, the emphasis on detailed planning and rehearsal, the distribution of maps and objectives down to platoon level, the specialization of infantry sections within platoons, all become standard practice in subsequent Allied operations. The Canadian Corps continues to refine these methods, going on to achieve stunning victories at Hill 70, Passchendaele, and during the 100 Days Offensive that finally ends the war in 1918. Today, over a century after the guns fell silent, Vimy Ridge continues to hold a special place in Canadian consciousness. The memorial remains one of the most visited Canadian landmarks in Europe. Each year on April 9, ceremonies commemorate the battle and honor those who fought there. The centennial commemoration in 2017 drew 25,000 Canadians to France, including thousands of students who made the journey to understand their nation's history. The preserved trenches and tunnels allow visitors to walk the same ground where Canadian soldiers fought and died. The landscape still bears the scars of war, with craters and shell holes visible across the memorial park. Unexploded munitions still lie buried in the soil, rendering large sections of the park too dangerous for public access, a reminder that even a century later, war's legacy endures. Whether Vimy represents the birth of a nation, or simply one important step in Canada's evolution toward full sovereignty and independence, its power as a symbol remains undeniable. For many Canadians, Vimy represents their country at its best, diverse people from across a vast nation working together toward a common goal, overcoming tremendous obstacles through skill, determination, and sacrifice. It represents innovation and preparation triumphing over brute force. It represents a young nation stepping onto the world stage and proving itself capable of great achievements. The victory came at a terrible cost, paid in the lives of thousands of young men who would never see home again. But their sacrifice was not meaningless. They fought believing they were making a better world, that their efforts would ensure future generations lived in peace. Whether that promise was kept, whether the Great War truly was the war to end all wars, remains a painful question. But the courage, determination, and skill demonstrated by those Canadian soldiers on that snowy April morning in 1917 deserves to be remembered and honored. If you found this deep dive into the Battle of Vimy Ridge compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations of pivotal moments in military history. The stories of sacrifice, innovation, and human determination that shaped our world deserve to be told, remembered, and learned from. Share this video with anyone interested in Canadian history or the First World War. And remember, by understanding the past, we gain perspective on the present and wisdom for the future.